of music, there's a time-honored tradition of borrowing the work of other composers. This can lead to compositions that are simple reorchestrations or arrangements. There could also be sets of variations on a theme by another composer. And there are also transcriptions that include sufficient alterations from the original, such that the transcription, to some extent, stands alone as an original composition. Some of the most famous examples in the repertoire are by J.S. Bach, who wrote a number of concertos for organ that are transcriptions of violin concertos originally by Antonio Vivaldi. One of the most famous of these is the organ concerto in A minor, BWV 593, after Vivaldi's Concerto for Two Violins in A minor, Opus 3, number 8. Another example in the last century would be Igor Stravinsky's ballet Pulcinella. It's entirely based on short keyboard pieces by other Italian composers, also from the Baroque period. In modern times, doing this without explicit permission can get you into legal trouble for violating someone's copyright. But in the past, borrowing from other composers was a common and much favored practice. Of course, even now, if the music is in the public domain, it's all perfectly legal. In 2015, I made an arrangement for solo bassoon of the four-voice fugue in D major from Johann Sebastian Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1. It's entitled Bachalicious. Why did I do this? It might sound like madness, arranging a multi-voice fugue for a single-line instrument. In fact, I got the idea from the Spanish composer Luis de Pablo, Solo Kunst, which is a virtuoso adaptation for solo clarinet of two of the four-voice fugues from Bach's seminal magnum opus, The Art of Fugue. In hearing a live performance of Solo Kunst, since I know the Bach original quite well, I was quickly able to figure out how it was done. That is, how the original fugue was chopped up and reorganized as a composition for solo clarinet. And then I immediately had ideas for a very different way to do it. My first idea was to adapt the Richard Carr in three voices, which is a fugue in all but name from J.S. Bach's A Musical Offering. But then I realized that the D major fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier was much more well suited for my concept. By the way, Bach's A Musical Offering is a rich compendium of a variety of pieces for different instruments, all based on a theme by another composer, namely Frederick II, King of Prussia. The title Bachalicious owes its existence to the fact that A Musical Offering bears the German title Musikalisches Opfer. I was going to title my adaptation Bachalicious Opfer, a Bach-like offering. Bachel? Bach? Ich? Bachley? It was immediately obvious that the title in English for something this goofy could only be Bachalicious. My bassoon studio at the time, to whom I showed my earliest drafts of the transcription, adamantly and gleefully insisted that had to be the title. If you're interested in how it was possible for me, in my madness, to adapt a complex four-voice fugue by Bach for the bassoon, you'll need a quick primer on what a fugue is all about. A fugue is a polyphonic composition. That means it is a composition that is comprised of multiple musical lines or voices, and each voice is considered hierarchically equal. Every fugue is built on one or more musical themes known as the subject. Simple fugues have only one subject, but it is certainly possible to have two or more. Let's stick with one. There are a few important criteria for a fugue subject. First, it needs to be memorable. The subject will reappear again and again in a fugue, and it is important for an attentive listener to be able to hear each reappearance or entry. This means the subject needs to have a very distinctive profile. It needs to be tuneful, if you will, and should probably be on the short side. The fugue subject should also be able to be broken into smaller pieces, known as motifs, that suggest the possibility of further development. Here's the subject for Bach's D major fugue that was the source of my transcription. Most of the music we hear is what we call tonal. This is actually a fairly technical term, and it should immediately be understood that there is a huge amount of great music all over the world that does not fulfill some or even any of the technical requirements for what tonality is or is commonly understood to be. But the fugue developed as a tonal form, and I'm going to restrict my comments to the traditional tonal model of the fugue. What does tonal mean? In the simplest sense, it means that there is a primary note around which all other notes orient themselves hierarchically. A tonal piece usually must end on this primary note, known as tonic. Tonal pieces don't actually have to start on tonic, but they still do more often than they don't. One of the primary tonal musical structures is called a scale, which begins and ends on tonic. There are 7 different notes in the traditional diatonic scale of Western common practice tonality, and each note that isn't the tonic has a subservient relationship to it. After the tonic, the next most prominent note in the scale is the 5th note, which is known as the dominant. In the key of D, the tonic is D, and the dominant is A. In a fugue, the first statement of the subject is always on the tonic. The second then is on the dominant. Subsequent entries of this subject in the remaining voices alternate between tonic and dominant. In between statements of the subject, there can be short phrases of music that do not contain a complete statement of the subject. These are known as episodes, and in Bach's fugues, he commonly employs them after the second voice has entered and stated the subject. Once every voice has entered with their own complete statement of the subject, this concludes what is known as the exposition. It's similar to the exposition of a sonata form movement, and what comes next is also similar. It's called the development. What the listener can expect in the development of a fugue includes multiple entries of the subject on notes of the scale besides tonic and dominant. The listener will also hear extended episodes, which are usually derived from a fragment or motif of the original subject. You might hear successive entries of the subject on top of each other, a technique known as stretto. And you might hear the subject being subjected to all sorts of different transformations. The only limits are those of the imagination and intent of the composer. Eventually, though, it's time to wrap things up. And typically you'll hear a clear, full statement of the subject, once again on the tonic. What follows is called the coda, which can contain more statements of the subject, but they'd usually be shortened or presented in stretto, and even more often you'll hear a short episode. Sometimes this is all presented over a single long-held note, usually in the bass, known as a pedal point. Everything stays in tonic and is wrapped up for once and for all on the last bar with what is known as a cadence, the final signal that we're done. Let's get back to Bachalicious. What I decided to do is always preserve the original statements of the subject or the primary melodic line at the same time and place as they were in the original fugue, and then ornament this melodic line with whatever notes are appearing in the other voices as harmony or counterpoint. Quick aside, adding ornamentation is an expected and necessary component of performance practice in the Baroque. So, in Bachalicious, the statements of the subject and the main melodic line of the episodes all appear exactly when they should, with the right notes at the right time, although some entries are changed by octave to suit the lower range of the bassoon. The creative part for me as the composer lay in choosing the embellishments, all based on the notes from the other voices. The application of these ornaments is varied throughout to avoid predictability. There were many choices to make, and I hoped that the changes I made via these ornamentations preserved the spirit and the sense of harmony of the original while adding a new dimension. I also wanted at least the head of the subject, the initial fast flurry of notes, to always be clear as the signal of a new entry of the subject, even when it is also ornamented. There is a wonderful technique developed in the Baroque period known as compound melody, wherein, through large register shifts, a single melodic line can suggest multiple voices. You can hear this technique, for example, in Bach's famous cello suites. The result in Bachalicious is an extraordinarily virtuosic showpiece for the bassoon. I admit that as I was working on it, I was not always 100% sure that I'd be able to play what I was writing. Bachalicious is really, really difficult. One of the hardest pieces I know. Yet, it's true, I have no one to blame but myself. Luckily, Bachalicious is also fun. The challenges are interesting, and I have found it very enjoyable to learn. Shortly after I completed the transcription, I presented it as a challenge to the bassoon world. Whoever premiered it first in public would receive a further prize, and that I'd write for them another piece for unaccompanied bassoon. One that would be a bit easier and be wholly original. My friend, Dan Lepori, who is the original dedicatee of Bachalicious, is a tremendous, fearless bassoon player. He won the prize, and he received the new piece, also dedicated to him, which is entitled Harkening. He played the premiere of Harkening as well. Here's Bachalicious, after the fugue in D major from the Well-Tempered Clavier by J.S. Bach.